Welcome back to the Composite Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Moore, and today we're joined by Nick McCallum from the Outlier Performance Center. Nick specializes in athlete prep and injury prevention, and he's here to share some crucial insights for bodybuilders on staying injury-free and really optimizing their performance. Nick, welcome.
Thank you for having me. What an intro.
No worries. I'm excited for this one for my own learning and as well as helping our listeners as well, of course. So could you start by telling us a bit about your own fitness journey and why you started Outlier Performance Center?
Yeah, sweet. So I guess for me, I probably started sort of being interested in the training environment, go right back to where I started playing a lot of sport as a kid and, significantly in sort of areas of cricket and rugby back in New Zealand. And then it sort of led me down the path of sort of playing a fair bit of rep cricket. And I was trying to sort of ascertain what the best approach was to sort of make myself a better player in that realm. And during that, I sort of become a bit of a closet bodybuilder, I guess, in the process. Like gradually over time, you just sort of started to see me as a young fella, probably in my 15, 16, 17, just sort of in the gym every afternoon. And I recall actually at S&C that we had at the time had to stop me from training extra days on the particular program that he had laid out for us, and I was doing these other sessions outside of the team environment stuff for the cricket. It sort of led me to that, and then I played a season of rep cricket at the end of high school and for Otago, and I remember in the off days, rather than resting and having some downtime, I was in the gym and probably doing everything that I know now not to sort of prioritize. But if I look back, I sort of like there was definite trajectory towards the fitness industry that was already happening, and I sort of had started working in a gym from the age of like 16. And then after school, I remember asking, I had a few PE teachers from school were sending the first 15 players to sort of get programmed by me and start personal training them after school, not qualified or anything by this stage. And sort of just I remember asking the gym owner, I said, is it all right if I start to train people after school? And he sort of said, well, do you know what the fuck you're doing? And I was like, well, it's one way to learn. So he said every session I had to go to him afterwards and tell him exactly what I did. And that was sort of what snowballed into then working in another fitness studio in New Zealand prior to moving here in 2016. And then the process to sort of learning what I do now, I guess, was I got over here and I was working a bit for Queensland Cricket, and I was sort of trying to reboot my cricket career a little bit. And in that process, I actually competed a year before that in bodybuilding, sort of scratched the itch that I needed to scratch. I think at that time when I was only young, I was sort of 18 or 19 and in the South Island competed. And I guess, got over here and I was like, I always wanted to play cricket in Australia. So started playing, and I noticed that I sort of started experiencing a bit of knee pain, and I sort of was trying to determine what the best approach was to sort of addressing it and how to go about sort of reversing the damage. Or I keep shopping around. I was looking for ideas. I was even hitting up old S&C coaches from first class cricket associations in New Zealand, and nothing really was hitting the nail on the head in terms of how I sort of felt towards the injury itself and its limitations, but then also what it was then perhaps doing to my, not only my performance component but also the sports. It led me down a path of I was sort of at a crossroads. I was like, either in order to fix these things, because I felt a little bit of a fraud, I guess, at that stage. I was working with people, I was coaching people, and I was limping in to train people, and I really felt this urge to sort of, this was not right, because these people were sort of, I'm guiding them on their training decisions, and ultimately I've got a sore knee, so it really threw me out a little bit, and it led me to sort of go, right, what's the method that I need to do? And I thought about going down the physio route. And it's not that I didn't agree with the way that physios address injury. It's more so that I felt like it's a reactive approach to addressing the injury. I feel like it's not really addressing the true cause. And so it led me to another individual called Ian King. And Ian, in the last sort of 4 decades, is synonymous with having coached about 30 different sports international level. One of his, I guess the expertise would be the Wallabies in the 90s. He had a successful run with winning 2 World Cups during that period. And he sort of started developing these ideas once he came out of, I think it was Sydney University, that he went there to sort of determine what the best way to train was, and when he left, he still didn't really know. And that's sort of how I felt. I was sort of at a crossroads. I was like, surely injuries aren't just something that just happens, and it's just as a result of what we prioritize. We just end up injured, and we go through this rehab sort of cycle where 1 minute we're performing, next minute we're breaking down, next minute we're performing again. And so I really felt quite strongly against that model, and everything he was saying was sort of making a lot of sense in regards to the way that I had seen and witnessed individuals prepare themselves physically, and then how I was coming into contact with individuals and experiencing it firsthand how their bodies are starting to get deteriorated. So, and he sort of, if you look into his sort of training methodology, I guess, developed some pretty interesting and industry changing perspectives on strength training and things like the hip dominant versus quad dominant and horizontal push, horizontal pull, vertical push, vertical pull, to categorize exercises into a line of movement and to sort of determine what the effects are on the body. And I developed a fair few exercises such as the single leg RDL and the king deadlift, and was probably the first to prioritize control based exercises prior to strength training. He sort of gave me a massive perspective. I sort of did 4 or 5 of his levels of his coach education from that time of sort of getting here in Australia. And then I really started to see the changes in other people's bodies as I was progressively applying these methods and just reverse engineering their program design that they'd sort of been previously applying. And once you sort of interpret the information that's in front of you, whether you look at the athlete's body and you decipher what is going on in the body, you kind of put the training program beside that and you go, well, these things, are they directly influencing or are they further deteriorating the athlete? And I started to, I never really learned how to assess anyone's body through Ian or anything like that. It was just through seeing enough people beginning to sort of determine sort of the outcomes that were being prioritized through the training decisions that sort of I developed an understanding of, and then looking at how I could then reverse it. And my anatomy and physiology sort of side of things, it's funny because throughout high school I was terrible at science and things like that. But as I sort of started looking and becoming more practical, and certainly sort of like I hadn't done any tissue work at this point sort of to address what was going on in individuals' bodies, but I felt this sort of real beckoning of understanding that I could see that there was a gap in the market in the way that we were doing physical therapy nationally and also globally. I felt like it wasn't really addressing the due cause. A lot of it was symptom-based assessment and a symptom-based treatment. So I seen a real gap in the market, and to be quite honest with you, I was relatively sick of sending athletes of mine or individuals of mine to get treatments, and then they'd come back and what I asked them to get treated wouldn't be being done. And that sort of got to a point where I was like, all right, something has to be done here, and there's a real gap. So through necessity alone, I kind of had to squeeze my way in there and started doing physical therapy. Obviously, went and got some qualification and insurances to be able to do so. But even before that, I was already starting to address and sort of feel tissue tone and looking to visual assessment to sort of determine what was going on in the body. And then the treatment side of things and developing a range understanding. And I remember just having a massage table for the first time and just going for like testing range and testing different areas for tissue tension. And that's the thing, like if you just run your hand down your leg, a lot of athletes will find out a little bit of information about what's going on in their body. But unfortunately, like in the virtual era, there's a real limitation of a lot of coaching that's done is they don't palpitate tissue, they don't develop an understanding of actually what's going on in the joint relationship, and hugely impactful. Like if most athletes just developed an understanding of tissue tension and range of or their limited range in certain areas within the joint relationship, it'd go a long way to developing a more balanced and injury-free world. But it's just sort of unfortunately, injuries are a lagging indicator, of a period of dysfunction. There's a period prior to that where the body's getting slowly worse, the joint health's declining. The injury is the last part of the puzzle. The discomfort or pain appears as a progressive stimulus that's occurred due to a down regulation of the joint relationship declining. And unfortunately for coaches who haven't really come to the party on that, is to look at their own training decisions as to how they influence those aspects. And unfortunately it takes a bit of an emotionless and non-egotistical approach to doing that, and you've got to eat shit a little bit in order to put the athlete's needs first. There's plenty of times where I've sort of had to develop an understanding, and through learning of applying things that would actually deteriorate somebody, I had to then reverse my own decisions and come to a conclusive understanding as to what was needing to be prescribed. So I guess gradually that sort of led me down the path of working with bodybuilders progressively. I remember 2019 working with Aaron Pilates and sort of hit off, a relatively large audience in the bodybuilding circles, and I guess probably put me on the map, as he likes to tell everyone and myself regularly, was the fact that he sort of, I guess, gave me a voice as something that I'd already been saying for a long time, as sort of saying that there was these progressive adaptions as a result of what we're prioritizing, and I guess it landed in the right hands. And then someone with a bit of authority in that space, probably arguably the best in Australia at the time, and probably still, he sort of gave me a voice and a bit of a platform to bodybuilders to sort of state that, what we're doing is inappropriate. And as we progressively fixed his shoulder, his back, and his knee, and he continued to grow and look better, his proof was in the pudding, and then more and more sort of over time started to come my way again. It's not that bodybuilders were the target audience, and it's not that they are even now. They probably make up about 5 to 10% of my clients. I definitely felt sort of the movement of how Outlier sort of came about was, I'd always felt like I'd been trying to convince the masses of doing something different, and not through. And at times, it's probably led me to falling on my own sword and sort of debating with other individuals. Now, sort of in a position where I think I'm comfortable in the direction that I have with clients, and rather than looking for necessarily who needs help, because as you gain perspective, like, you realize that majority apply relatively average parameters to their strength training, and particularly injury rehabilitation. And they sort of stay stuck in that injury re-injury cycle until eventually the surgeon gets a hold of them, and then off they go for surgery. And once you sort of accept that, you kind of look at who's needing help or who's wanting your help more so than anything, and then sort of focusing your target on those people. And those people become your biggest advocates, the ones that are willing to make a non-emotional or a completely emotionless decision to sort of do what needs to be done in order to fix whatever's going on in the body. But not only that, enhance their athletic careers. Like, if you improve the joint position, you aid the recoverability of the joint. And this is where treatment's sort of misguided globally, is that there's a theory or a thought process that treatment fixes the problem. Treatment just aids the recoverability of the joint. It's the training program that's the glue, and if you don't understand how your prescription of exercise is then dictating the joint relationship, the strength training has the largest influence on the joint health long term than anything else. And until you recognize the repetitiveness of that, and with load, and then you see the joint changes occur over time, and you can watch an athlete be prescribed an imbalanced strength program. And I've done it. You witness their bodies just deteriorate over a period of time, and you can predict when the injury is going to happen. There's two types of injuries I perceive as, if there's a joint discrepancy, there's the injury that's happened and the one that's about to happen. And if you look at the body, you can actually see that progressively happen, especially if you've got then the blueprint, which is the training program. So I guess Outlier was a byproduct of feeling a little bit of a lone wolf on that journey to sort of almost convince people, and over the years my ego's got the best of me, and I've sort of tried to present that in different ways for people to understand. And there's resistance to it, like anything, like 3 stages of truth: first ridiculed, second violently opposed, and then accepted as it's always been that way. As you look at stretching, for instance, like prime example. Who would have thought in 2023 or 2024, telling an athlete to stretch would have been seen as some sort of incompetence, like, yet if you develop range of the joint, the athletes that do it and have done it well, and have prioritized it for a long period, reap the rewards. I've never heard someone who's stretched and you've done it yourself. You did a stretch yourself that day with me, and I've never heard someone get off the ground and go, I feel terrible after that. And particularly, I've witnessed athletes firsthand sort of progressively change as a result, and reduce the nerve irritation, the joint positioning being negatively declined over time. And as a bigger model, I guess, you integrate the training and the other prescription of other things in there as well. It sort of starts to reverse the damage. So, as I said, sort of then Outlier sort of came as a result of that. And then I found a little location in the Gold Coast to plant the seed. And we've been there for a year now, and as a facility, I guess. And we'll see where it goes. Like, as a brand, I think it's got lots of potential as as I think it does stand for something that I feel like people do value once they see it for what it is.
Yeah, epic. Well, it's so cool to hear your story and kind of how you developed as a person and how that transferred into your business as well. And I think the work that you're doing is so needed and so important. There's definitely a gap in the market for that, particularly in New Zealand and, of course, in Australia as well. So, speaking of injuries, what are the most common injuries that you see in female bodybuilders and what steps can be taken to prevent them?
Yeah, good question. I sort of touched on this a few years ago. I felt like there was sort of a reoccurring theme, particularly for bodybuilders, when it with regards to female bodybuilders in particular. I've sort of seen a fair amount of lumbar related issues that stem, I think, if you look back at the training models that are applied for female bodybuilders, particularly, you sort of see an emphasis being placed on the glutes. And then I would say, as the categories have changed over time and the need for developing probably more structure, particularly X-frame of the upper body, you've started to see some really specific adaptations to the upper body, which, the health of the shoulder and stuff is then, become affected. And I think as you go up the muscle density and the categories, you tend to see sort of more frequent sort of type of injuries. If I looked at a female in particular, I would say, yeah, a lot of lower back, a lot of shoulder, and I would say the reasoning for that is the over prioritization over being specific to the area that you want to grow. I touch on this quite a lot with Aaron actually recently, but even with Alicia Kyrgios, I sort of said an area that she had always wanted to develop and improve was the glutes. But prior to my involvement, she was sort of, I think it was a 16-to-1 ratio of quad to hip based programming. So, what I mean by that is anything with a vertical trunk, anything with a torso trunk that's 45 degrees or more vertical favors the influence of the quad. And anything 45 degree or more horizontal favors the influence of the posterior chain. And so it's rather than looking at it from where I feel the muscle, look at from the function of the joint position and how it's ultimately used. And I guess a lot of females tend to try and find ways to target the glutes by priority, and that's fantastic. They've found a way to try and load the glutes, and there's an obsession towards that market. Now, the challenge that then creates is individuals with that emphasis tend to go into lumbar extension quite excessively, so they extend the lumbar more than they extend the hip. So you start to exceed the anterior rotation of the pelvis starts to occur, which is the pelvis being pulled forward gradually over time, which increases the lumbar lordosis, which, the force production down the leg is reduced. Things like sciatic nerve with the externally rotated stance that most people stand in and walk in. I call it the duck walk, but progressively there's these really direct adaptations as a result of what's being prioritized. So you sort of see, if you look in most strength programs and you look across both male and female with this, but if you see particularly with the female, because they're really specific to wanting to develop the glutes, they've conditioned their brains to thinking that, to put the joint in this particular position to try and feel the glute, rather than understanding the function of the glute itself, perhaps to extend the hip or abduct the hip or even externally rotate the hip. So yeah, there's been these really sort of wacky and wild ways that the glutes have sort of become loaded. There was sort of a few years ago, I probably was arch nemesis number one for chronic hip thrusters in Australia. Not because I had any disinterest in hip thrusting. I had actually I come to my own sort of understanding of that through probably 2015, 2016. I'd seen the exercise being popularized. Perhaps in my own understandings of okay, I wanted to develop the glutes. So I felt like it was relevant to cricket and sport, and then I sort of began to feel like the over prioritization of it and the loading of it was inappropriate for what it was then trying to create. And being a mid range, in my later understandings, was being a mid range, partially quad dominant exercise. It's partial knee extension and it's partial hip extension. So you've got athletes that, by prioritization of their program design, are already exceeded in the number of quad exercises they usually apply. And what I mean by that is, if I touch on my concept before that, Ian King developed around the lines of movement, which was the trunk angle being the dictator. Now look at the amount of programs that feature a lunge variation, a Bulgarian split squat variation, a step up or a step down variation, a goblet squat or a back squat of some sort, a leg press of some sort, a hack squat of some sort, a pendulum of some sort, and then you compare that to the number of exercises prioritized for the posterior chain. Like, We might see an RDL, we might see a back extension, but by load potential alone, look at those exercises, look at the complexity of the number of joints involved, ankle, knee, and hip, and then you compare that to a single joint, a bilateral, 2 legs, hip extension of back extension or an RDL. No one deadlifts because everyone's got a story that, once upon a time I hurt my back doing deadlifts, and so they avoid doing that. And if they don't, they use I call the ugly sibling, which is the trap bar, and then they go to a more vertical trunk position and stand up and use more quads. There's a revolving door of emphasis of quads. So when I sort of made some comments publicly about my belief around the hip thrust being not inappropriate, but the way that it was being applied with relevance to the rest of the program design, it was like anything. You see major actresses and actors get ridiculed for making a comment in 2012. Well, they didn't really see the big picture as to what I was trying to state. I was trying to sort of make reference to the fact that in combination with these things, I believe that the pelvic position is already anteriorly rotated excessively as a result of the quad prioritization. And I don't believe a kickback, an RDL, and a back extension does enough to change that relationship in order to support the pelvic position long term. And so you sort of started to see the deterioration of the lumbar spine, particularly in competitors. You're seeing the twisting and rotating of the hip to one side, sort of that really specific adaptation, which is if you pose to one side, just like a golfer. If a golfer swings a club one way progressively, well, a bikini competitor poses consistently to one side. I'm not going to do it because you'll laugh at me, but reality is that sort of those adaptations that are occurring in the body. So, like sport, if you swing the club or roll the arm over one way consistently, and there's not a progressive adaptation the other way, if you don't swing it the other way, there's a cost. There's a repetitive cost, and if you're not reversing it through your strength training decisions, you're going to see that imbalance magnified. And if I touch on the upper body imbalances that I believe occurred was, particularly with bikini athletes wanting to develop the shoulders, 90% of the population has internally rotated shoulder forward posture with elevation of the scapula. That's by priority of what we do. We live and work jobs in front of us, and we sit for long periods at desks and drive cars, etc. But the really specific adaptations of the scapular position is being pulled forward progressively and elevated progressively. So we see high tension in the upper trapeze, we see high tension in the chest muscles. And for females, if gone through puberty early, develop breasts early, they tend to roll the shoulders further forward. If a tall girl wants to make herself shorter, she hunches a little bit more. So there's psychosomatic components to that as well. I would say that compounded with then the prioritization over the anterior based shoulder muscles by priority as a way of wanting to grow them, we've then seen the negative changes to the joint relationship over time, and then the athletes look like this. And then you add, breast implant surgery, you add a number of other things on top of that, whether it's under the muscle, over the muscle. There's some really unpredictabilities to what's occurred at the joint over time. So, and if you look at the balance of training decisions, you don't tend to see a lot of the external rotator being prioritized. You don't see a lot of the lower trap being prioritized. There's a lot of pull down, a lot of pull over, limited amount of horizontal pulling movements, particularly for females. There's a lot of face pulls. There's a lot of rear delt type of specific exercises, but there's not a lot of horizontal pulling, and there's not a lot of load being used for those movement patterns. So and then if I was to sort of look at specific adaptations through work lifestyle and things that females tend to do more of is, more computer orientated work and things like that, then you start to see some really specific adaptations. So I think if you only were to look at a female competitor side on, you see the curvature in the upper body, you'll start to really see the changes that have happened over their lifetime through what they've prioritized. And so, yeah, I would say lumbar pain and shoulder pain sort of stem from a few of those sorts of variables that have been maybe unconsciously applied and maybe some consciously. I'm not saying that you can't do those things at times within an athlete's preparation, but it has to be balanced, and you have to sort of look at, if you don't address the dysfunction first, it's going to bite you at some point. And so there's times to be specific, particularly for competitors that want to grow things. But if the joint relationships decline in the process, you can't go specific straight away. You might have to come back to it or prioritize this stuff first to try and address, and then be able to prioritize that stuff later within the program week or the program day.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like program and exercise selection is so important for preventing those types of injuries. Is there anything else that competitors can do to prevent those kinds of injuries?
Yeah, so the big one for me is as I touched on previously, the application of flexibility. Now, the thing with flexibility that most people, the difference between people who stretch and don't stretch, one has a lot more time on their hands. So, to stretch well and do it properly, it takes time, and it's definitely not something that is easy. I think there's probably a training concept loss or understanding there that someone mentioned somewhere along the line that stretching should be relaxing and it should be therapeutic. And to some degree it can be, but most often it's agony. It causes a lot of discomfort in terms of just the feeling itself. And not to say that you want to develop relaxation throughout that changing of range in order to apply it effectively. But for most people stretching for the first time and they do it properly, particularly with me when they haven't experienced it before, it's not a joyful experience because they're learning their limitations. And so when people kind of, if you were to say, hey, I'm going to teach you how to do something the very first time and I'm going to put you in a lot of pain, there's not really a great buy-in after that. So I think people are sort of a little bit delusioned at times and thinking that, it should just be easy and relaxed, and they can be on their phone texting, or they can be talking to their girlfriend, or they could be having a latte at the cafe. Like, it's not like that. It's going to hurt, and it should be treated like a training quality, such as strength. It should be treated just as you would train a strength session. So taking it away from, I just have to do this for 10 minutes before I start training, or, some people will apply it afterwards. Remove it from that environment completely and go, all right, this is a training session. How do I apply this effectively, and what do I need to do in order to get the best range? Find a relaxed environment, try and improve the soft tissue tone before you enter the training, into that environment. So whether you foam roll, you do some tissue work, whatever you need to do. Increase joint temperature, so put on some warm clothes, turn the aircon off if you have to, and you'll find that there's a little bit more. Put your phone away as well, like little things like that, and do repetitive sets. So a lot of the time people stretch to a timer and they think that the body is all of a sudden going to go at 59 seconds and 0.8 seconds. It's going to go, all right, now I'm going to open that range for you and life's going to feel good. It doesn't work like that. Your body's not sort of working on that basis. Relaxation's the biggest thing. So once you've got to develop that new range, developing an ability to be able to relax into it. And then it's like the shower principle. Don't apply it once a week. You wouldn't shower once a week, so apply it progressively across your week. And it's an accumulated effect. So it's like, if it doesn't, don't get attached to it needing to be, I didn't quite hit, 45 minutes of stretching today. Some days you might not hit 45 minutes of stretching. Obviously, it's probably the only physical quality that if you do more of it, the better you get. Unlike strength and unlike speed and endurance sort of as qualities themselves, Ian King touches on that, is it's the only physical quality among the four that have a positive influence no matter how much you do. And it's relatively at random as well. So everyone's been to a yoga studio. Now, other than some of the positions that you've developed into that during that session, depending on the instructor's teaching, everyone's walked out of that feeling relaxed, new range. It's about the only thing you can do. It's about the only group class that I would say that's relative. It might upset a few people, but it's about the only group class that you could go that has no real specificity to you as an individual that you're going to create some positive adaptations from. Gee whiz, I'm going to have hate mail for that, but but it's the reality. You can't walk into a strength training environment and just do random amounts of strength training, application and expect a positive outcome. And so for flexibility, that's the inverse. You can do as much as you really want, and you're going to only improve the health of the soft tissue. You're going to improve the joint position. You're going to have more coordination ability, greater force production, etc. And so the I guess the detractors from stretching don't like the time that it takes. The suggestion of it being something that could create weakness or muscle weakness, or something that has a negative effect prior to training. Well, if you look at the scientific community and the way that it applies its application of information, is it lacks a real critical component, which is the real world. And so for me, if you take an athlete and you're going to apply a flexibility-based session, they're going to develop relaxation, they're going to lie down for long periods, and then they're going to go into a specific environment, such as a strength environment, and then do a strength-based activity where arousal levels need to be high, motivation needs to be high, intake of caffeine or whatever they're going to need post-stretch might occur. And there's progressive sets There's warm-up sets, there's probably warm-up exercises. In my case, there's control drills, abdominal work, presets prior to the, etc. So the scientific community doesn't really look at the specifics of any athlete. They just look at, hey, we've applied this stretch and then we've gone and told the athlete to do a maximal effort, and then we've, created a theory based on that. And it just lacks the critical component that it doesn't apply to the real world. And so what we've done is we've developed this, I guess, this prejudice towards people who stretch and foam roll and lower tissue tone and recover if anyone ever goes and they roll their chest and they roll their lats and their upper traps and their hip flexors and their quads, it would go a long way to fixing majority of injuries. And if you develop some stretching approaches around those particular areas, you'd probably see a lot of the soft tissue changes would aid the health of your body. But because someone in a white coat who decided to fund a study decided that once upon a time we're going to discredit the use of these activities, and instead for the sales of strength training equipment where there's a lot more funding and there's a lot more commercial incentive, it's pretty hard to convince someone to go stretch when there's no product to sell with it. What are you going to sell? The stretching strap and maybe a $20 foam roller? That's really a bit of a hard sell, So, and when I tell you might have to do it for 2 hours to create a positive change, it's not many people want to come do that with me. But those that do and those that commit to it for a period of time, it doesn't mean you have to start at that level. But I got a real rude awakening in my own journey along that line. I thought I stretched and I thought I stretched well. And then when I came across, coaches who coach at elite level in sport and was put in that environment, and I was the only one who didn't have knee sleeves on. I was the only one that didn't have a stretching strap. I used my shoelaces to tie a strap together. And then rather than having a knee pad or a knee block to make my knee comfortable, I used my shoe. And I was like, wow, this is a reflection of the value that I place on flexibility currently. And so most athletes, when they look at their strength training equipment, how many of them have got belts, how many of them have got different devices to aid their strength production, but the strength training decisions are the one that's compromising them. The quality of flexibility and improving the range and soft tissue, they don't have any of those other devices that aid that. So that's one thing. And then I would say the biggest other one would be regular soft tissue work. I've touched on obviously my theory around the way that it's being applied globally. I don't really feel like it hits the nail on the head, but definitely soft tissue work, and if it's done well, is phenomenal. In sport, there's been numerous athletes over the last 50 years who are prime examples of their coaches doing large amounts of soft tissue. Charlie Francis is a phenomenal one with Ben Johnson. Up to 6 to 7 hours of tissue work on an athlete prior to being involved in a 100-meter sprint, and there's, crazy stories if anyone's ever interested in that. But myself, like having witnessed the changes to the joint position, over time and watching athletes' bodies change and seeing some really fast change. Like I'm talking like an athlete walks in debilitated, unable to, stand up straight or lean over and touch the ground, to then immediately after soft tissue work, seeing that change, it's like, why wouldn't we apply it? And particularly if it has a impact on improving the joint position to then prior to load, like, yeah, for me, if you're not going to do your own tissue work, whether it's on a soft ball or a foam roll or a bit of PVC piping, then you go pay some other person to do it for you. And just make sure if they lie your face down, run while you still can and get out of there. But if they lie your face up, then and they do tissue work on the front predominantly, and you've got to walk in with a bit of a game plan. So if you're working with a coach that's is sort of looking at identifying these things, and they're looking at the tissues that are pulling on the joint position, and they're sort of trying to devise a bit of a plan within their training program as to how do we change that. Go in there with a plan of attack. Don't go in there and go, oh, my neck's sore, I don't know why, and then you wake up 45 minutes later and you can't turn your neck at all. It's like, don't go in there with that plan expecting to have a real specific outcome. If you go in there with no plan whatsoever, you're gonna eat shit. Come with a game plan and say, I want these areas worked on. This is the plan of attack. I want to try and do this. And it's because of that. That's how I learned my soft tissue models. I certainly didn't learn it from the course I did. That was, park that ship. But when I came out of that environment, I started looking at particularly kinesiologists and Eastern European physical therapists, and I really liked the way that they looked at things constructively and developed a sort of a cause and effect relationship with them, what they treat, why they treated it, and then the specific outcome that they were looking to gain from it. And so there's, just like strength training, there's a direct transfer from what you do. So if you apply something, you should see what changes immediately. So if I go tell you to go do a glute kickback and I see excessive amounts of lordosis in the lumbar, if I then cue the abdominals and the glutes to fire together and we see a positive change, I should see when you're standing statically, posturally, that there's a positive change as a result. I should see less lordosis in the lumbar. So if I go treat the hip flexors pulling on the pelvis anteriorly, I should see when you stand up, there's less lordosis in the lumbar as a result. Or if I see the shoulder pulled forward and I treat the muscles that are pulling it forward, I should be sitting back by the time I treat it. Whereas what the rest of the world does, lies your face down, rubs the back of the shoulder. By the end of it, you walk out like this. It's like it doesn't really aid that. So those are some really, I guess, things. And the last thing for aiding that is your program design. Touched on it, but it is the glue. Like you can do all the other stuff. That's great. If you're doing that, it will save you for a period of time. But ultimately, the strength training is what's going to throw you if it's not. If it's not the glue, it's not holding the joint relationship together, and it's not prescribing based on the joint position that's deteriorated, you're not then trying to improve that position through your exercise prescription. And the ways that you do that is, sequence is one really important thing. So what you do first is what you do best by specificity. So if your quad based exercises and your bench press are first, particularly for males, on a Monday or a Tuesday, you're going to see that specific adaptation. So if you're squatting on a Monday or a Tuesday and then, they followed up with a leg press, a lunge, a hack squat, a pendulum, every other variation of quad dominant exercise prescription, or even if it's not and you've sort of developed sort of these other exercises that you intend on reversing some of that stuff and they come first, but by what I said before, they're relatively low load. There's no real, it might be a single joint exercise and it's not doing enough to counteract the other exercises that are larger and more dominant. You got to weigh up apples and oranges as to which ones you prioritize at what. And so I'll give you an example. Like if you look at Ali Kyrgios as an example, she came to me with a excessive lordosis spine where she had significant lordosis with sway back posture. So basically the torso looked like this, the lumbar was here, and the weight distribution, and she was holding on to bub and leaning back like that quite specifically, increasing that shape. Then the training program she'd been prescribed previously was significantly increasing that imbalance. So she had a large number of anterior-based exercises, shortening the quad and the hip flexor. No abdominal work that was specific. Now, I love the scientific community. They've named a number of abdominal exercises after zoo animals, bird, dog, and cats, and cat, cow, all that other crap. But there's not really an application of it that I think that transfers to the longevity of performing an abdominal exercise like any other exercise that the body, is trying to create a stimulus or an adaptation towards, is there's no progressive stimulus. So they developed a model to add more coordination ability, but in coordination being one of the early adaptations, you're not then creating an ongoing stimulus where the strength of the abdominals improve over time. And so, for her, for instance, when the abdominals were weak post her second child, I think, we've seen some really negative changes to the positioning of the spine, and particularly in that lumbar region, and she went through a bit of hell with it as a result. So if your strength training doesn't support the change within the joint relationship, and then through what you're being prescribed, that's then down regulating that relationship further, don't expect the other stuff to fix that. The one thing I couldn't emphasize more is your strength program is your rehabilitation program. There is no rehab approach that you can ever apply that will reverse this. It's like the diet. If you can't out train a shit diet, right? So if your consumption of calories are too high and you're training 25,000 times a day, and you're not gonna reverse that method. So it's the same with injury. So you can't just go, oh, I'll go to the physio once a week. He'll keep me going through the bikini prep. Hopefully I get through to the end and I get a plastic trophy and I stand up there. But when I stand up there, I can't even stand upright. And I try to get photos with my family and I'm in agony. It doesn't really support the ongoing method of your strength program should be the glue. And I guess there's not enough of a view of the longevity perspective in that. Is bodybuilding, I'm sorry, there's no sport that is more specific to understand than bodybuilding. It's the easiest sport. I work with athletes that collide, impact with each other, and I've got to work out what's being applicable to those athletes and the joint challenges that they have. And they strap their shoulder to their arse cheek and hope their shoulder stays intact. Whereas with bikini athletes, there's really specific adaptations that's occurring in the body as a result of what you apply in the gym. That's it. Nothing else as by priority, So it's not as if someone's pushing the squat rack over or anything like that. You don't got to worry about that. But The thing is that through the exercise prescription itself, is you can either enhance or deteriorate the athlete's body, and that's as easy as it gets for bodybuilders. There's no excuse. There's no excuse for bodybuilders to be injured. I hate to say it to the individuals that, everyone's witnessed a bodybuilder and they've got 45 layers of strapping tape around their elbows and their knees, and if they take them off, their elbows would explode. But unfortunately, it's a frail view of really poor program design over time. And I hate to say it because there's going to be people that get upset by it, but it's the reality. Is as a collective industry, we've accepted that poor program design and poor methods of training are okay. And bodybuilders who, if they didn't realize that their joint range, if it was to improve, and the positioning of the joint was to improve, they'd be better bodybuilders. And I've got a case on case on case on case of and examples of that. Aaron is a prime example. Alicia's now beginning to be a prime example. Hattie was an example. All athletes who have phenomenal ability and genetic structure, but hit a roadblock either through injury and then repetitively trying to grow an area that they can't grow because the joint relationships decline.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think all of that is so important, but bikini competitors in particular are so focused on, the feedback that they get from the judges. Like it's always more glutes, more glutes, more glutes. So for someone who is getting that kind of feedback, what are your tips for glute growth without risking injuries and those negative adaptations?
100%. So for me, if you're going to do 101 variations of glute exercises, then understand that the force couple relationship of posterior rotation of the pelvis, the muscles that pull the pelvis posteriorly, are the glute and the hamstring. Now, in order to aid that position, the abdominal tone has to be high. I've touched on the abdominal strength needs to be relative to the production of the gluteals. Because if it's not, you'll see progressive adaptation to increasing that, which the spine is then being exceedingly influenced. And so you see a chronic deterioration of the lumbar, discs, etc. as a result. And you've only got to look at someone's side on to visually see that. You see the lumbar extension, you see them like this, and you go, I wouldn't like to be your back in that shape. So, and there's probably a predisposition, particularly for females, given the hip structure and to that shape already. And then you add a number of exercises which are trying to create tension in the gluteals. So I think the piece of the puzzle there is if you're increasing the soft tissue tone in the gluteals and then reducing it in the muscles which pull on the pelvis anteriorly, and supporting that with the abdominal training being featured at the front of the workout. So if you're going into a strength session, rather than leaving your abdominal work towards the end, understand the force couple of posterior rotations, the abdominals contracting and the gluteals contracting to aid that positioning of the pelvis. Now, what I mean by why that's important is because if you don't sustain that, you're going to fall into anterior rotation, and then the intended effect would be to load the glutes. You're just going to load the lumbar spine. So support the pelvic position being sustained in that position first by training the weakest link first, the abs and the glutes, in a position to create that position. Then that's your glue. You've got that for your training session at the start. You've reduced the soft tissue tone on the muscles which pull it the other way at the start. You might have done some foam rolling and some stretching, God forbid. And then you've gone into prioritizing those things first. And then by the time you're getting to the exercises that might negatively pull that pelvis here and exceedingly create that specific adaptation, it's not going to have such an impactful effect on the health of the lower back as a result. So be specific around the exercises you're choosing. Make sure they actually do what they intend on doing. So make sure that if you are trying to train the glute, well, by priority alone, you're actually doing something that trains the glute. I really beg to differ when individuals jump in a squat rack and they hope that they're training their glutes. Because of the specific adaptations that the shortening of the hip flexor creates for the pelvic position exceedingly, then you see the distension in the abdomen as a result, and then the limitation to be able to shorten the glute whilst the pelvis is so anteriorly rotated. So when you've got a quad dominant variation of a split squat, a lunge, a leg press, a squat pattern, and you're hoping to train the glutes in those, just understand that you might not be getting as much glute as you perceive, if any, particularly if your pelvis is in that shape that I said. So make sure that the exercise you do first is one that actually supports you changing that pelvic position to improve it. And then if you did that, you're going to save yourself a lot of pain long term.
Mm,
If anyone's ever experienced a back injury, you know how chronically debilitating it can be. So I'm sure that if you can start to apply something that supports that relationship changing positively, then those things go not only a long way to improving your lower back health, but also your glutes will develop as a result.
yeah. Absolutely. I love that advice. And then obviously posing for bodybuilders, especially females, can be pretty physically demanding and lead to pain and tightness over time. And obviously that positioning of the pelvis as well. So is there any ways that competitors can offset the negative effects of posing practice? And is there a time that they should be posing as well? Because I know some competitors pose straight before training.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. So one thing for me is if you look at posing as being the sport, so say for instance, like any other sport I work with, you can't avoid it. It's going to happen. So that's a specific adaptation as a result of this, what the sport creates. So don't try and necessarily change it too much. What I would say, the volume of it needs to be relative to what's currently going on in your body. So if you're doing 3 hours of posing, consider that perhaps how much of it's useful. And the volume of it could be relative to the what's going on in your body. So I think, as anything, is the skill set getting better as a result of what you're doing, rather than thinking of posing as purely just you're practicing your routine. It's a skill set you're developing. It's an awareness of your body, right? So look at it like the more that you do, does that aid your improving what you're trying to achieve, which is obviously to pose better? And if you were to do it in less volume, but do it and try and be more specific to nailing it in those specific, like initial approaches to it, and just build your understanding of it over time, rather than do 2 hours twice a day, you know, in the lead up to comp. So I hear it all the time as coaches say, get posing practice in early. I would agree, but I think the biggest thing is don't overwhelm yourself with doing so much posing to make up for your lack of understanding in the initial stages. So develop your understanding of that as a skill set first, and monitor your volume would be one thing. But then also from a preparation around that, as I said, if I'm preparing an athlete who's going to be involved in sport and they're going to go practice the skill set for 45 times a week and do it, half an hour every time they do it, it's going to be really hard to reverse that damage. So reduce the amount of it, bring the training stimulus down a bit, try and do it really well when you do it. And then when you're in the strength training environment, all the things that that are going to help, reduce the influence, such as stretching, flexibility, and your control work or your activation of the areas that are currently not firing, etc. And your tissue work, then you're not got to climb a mountain to reverse it. But if you're doing such a high volume of it, and I understand why, is it can be a scary thing if you don't have it down pat. But look at it from a macro rather than the micro, as like, oh my god, I'm not going to look good on stage. You're also not going to get to stage if you don't address what's going on in your body. um, I think, yeah, have a longer window of understanding as to make sure you learn your posing early, but then also when you go to manage your volume of your posing, understand that this is all good and well to try and reverse it. You're stretching, your tissue work, your activation exercises, and if you apply those before, it can reduce the negative effects of this, and hopefully your strength program that you're following is actually already reversing the damage. Those are your big pieces of the puzzle. But if this is then coming across every week and swiping it off the table, you've got to put those puzzle pieces back on every time. So yeah, my advice would be volume, and then make sure you've got some things in there that help reduce the cost.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that advice. I think a lot of competitors leave their posing too late and then they do a super high volume of it close to the comp as well, which obviously has a negative impact. And then, of course, you're in a calorie deficit as well. So, physiologically, does being in a calorie deficit during a comp prep affect the competitor's body?
Yeah, look, I think what it does is it definitely, from a recoverability perspective, I've seen cases where I'd say that athletes become a bit high attention, and whether you could say that it's necessarily 100% entirely around reduction of calories, it could be a lack of sleep, which then body's holding more tension. It could be a number of things that are considerations there. So I would say, as a whole, the deeper in the hole you go as a competitor and towards the later stages of prep, those components of recoverability would probably struggle to sort of hold up towards the end. So yeah, I think those things where you don't want to be in the position where you're trying to get yourself out with a shovel toward the end to sort of get there. You want to have had, this is where I think something that the bodybuilding community lacks a little bit, is a real annual year planning around their preps. I know we have an off season, I know we have an in season, but there's a lack of consideration around what the off season needs to look like from a programming perspective. So train the weakest link, improve in the generalized. So in the annual year, I'm not sure if everyone would know, but you've got a generalized preparation phase, a specific preparation phase, a competitive phase, and a transition phase. During that generalized preparation phase, we're trying to reverse the damage that's occurred in the body from either the competitive phase or aspects of the specific phase. So this is the glue. Now, most people think that their off season is just about adding as much lean tissue as they possibly can, and I agree. But you can do that whilst reversing the damage that's occurred previously, perhaps due to the sport. So the girls that go from prep to prep to prep to prep to prep, are they giving themselves no time during that period of time to increase the recoverability of the joint health long term? And then are they actually improving in that time as well, would be another question I ask. But beyond that, I think, yeah, making sure that by the time you've got to the competitive phase, you're not trying to patch a leaky boat along the way. You know, you're not trying to plug the holes that start seeping. Like, how many girls get towards midway through prep and they've got pain everywhere in their bodies, they're hurting because they've driven up, activity through the roof. Their training's the hardest it's ever been. It's been the most diligent and most focused it's ever been. And now they're getting these really specific adaptations from all the work that they're doing, which is affecting the joint position. So don't put yourself in this position where you don't expect these things to just randomly pop up. They're not random. They're there as a result of what you've prioritized. And so make sure prior to that point, you've got some really big rocks in play and you've set yourself up for not just physically looking a particular way, but physically being able to reverse the damage in your body as well.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some red flags in a competitor's off season that would indicate that they're potentially going to have trouble during their prep and with injuries?
Look, where do we start with that? But the biggest one is if I see a joint position that's unfavorable to like if I see some really chronic sort of looking conditions in the body of the joint position, like the joint is the messenger. So the positioning of the joint tells you more than necessarily the muscle tells you. The bone is the messenger. Now, surgeons, they love dealing with the bone because they just go in there and they remove it or they shave it and they off you go back to doing what you're doing. Shit training gets you back to shit therapy and then you get back to the surgeon again. But beyond that, if competitors don't understand that, as I said, if your training doesn't try and reverse that position that you've accumulated. So if you've got rounded shoulders, don't, oh no, my mum had rounded shoulders. Oh, my dad had sway lumbar spine. Oh no, we've got bad knees in our family. Those are, even if that is the case, that's even more the reason to try and reduce the cost of what's occurred at that joint from progressive stimulus over time. Whether you've played sport as a kid, whether your work life puts you in a hunch every day, if you're working at an office desk, whatever it is that you're creating tension in within your body, there's an opportunity there not only to make you a better bodybuilder, but it's also an opportunity to aid the recoverability of the joint through what you prioritize. Your off season needs to look like reversing the damage primarily as objective number one. So your program design needs to be a blueprint to reverse the costs in the current positions you've got. If you don't look at your program, if I look at your program, I look at your body, and then I look back at your program and I go, well, that's going to create more of that. That's going to create more of that. So if I see your front raises, your lateral raises, your 500 different variation of shoulder exercises, and you've already got elevation and protraction, and then I go, so why are you doing that first? And it's the first workout of the week. And then you go, oh, well, I just need to grow my shoulders. And I go, well, you're not going to be able to grow your shoulders because your shoulders are going to be increasingly internally rotated and elevated, and then the pain's going to start to exist, and you're not going to be doing any raises of any kind, and then you're not going to be able to train your shoulders at any stage of your prep. Or when you are, it's going to cause you more pain. So understand that there's a cost. And the same for the lower back. And you go, all right, well, you've got 501 different variations of a lunge here. That's going to increase the quadricep tension, which is going to pull the pelvis anteriorly. You're going to get some lumbar related issues. Then you're going to load up your other side because that's the non-damaged leg, and then you're going to have a knee problem on that side. All right, so if we're not understanding that that's the effect that this is having right now, make sure that that is fixing that for a start. And then you're in a position to go, all right, now because that's sitting there, we can add an exercise that we want to develop shoulders in here. Now we want to be a bit more specific to the quad because we feel like we need to be. We can add that here. So there's a lack of object thought processing around when to apply what, and they just go, oh, we just need to grow these areas, and we're going to do 400 sets a week on trying to grow these areas. And then, oh, damn, I got an injury now. I don't know what to do. And then they go, do some physical therapy. They hope that's going to improve it, and then they go back to the same thing, and they repeat that. Yeah, that would be number one, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is so important. And all of the messages really that you've shared in this podcast has been super important. Some great tips as well for people to take on board. I feel like we've only just really scratched the surface of these topics. So where can listeners find you online for more tips or also to inquire about your services or coaching?
Yeah, so just on Instagram, I'm Coach Nick McCallum. The gym's called Outlier Performance Center. The gym's located in Carrara, just beneath KDV Sports. So there's a big facility there that's multi-purpose: tennis, golf, mini golf, pickleball, all of that. And there's my gym buried in all of that. So we're there. But otherwise, yeah, Instagram's probably the best handle to get me. And then, yeah, just located on the Gold Coast. And obviously work online with individuals from overseas in different areas as well. And there's a few ways we can operate. It's not limited to just being in person.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And thanks to our listeners as well. If you like this episode, please share your stories, tag Nick, tag the Outlier Performance Center, myself, and the Comp Closet, and also give the show a rating on the platform that you're listening to it on, because it really does help us grow and get more incredible guests on like Nick. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.